or ask them directly by using raise a hand function during the Q&A at the end. And now I'm pleased to introduce our speaker, Tabitha Campbell. So Tabitha is Nehiyaw Pewatonak and a registered member of Pi Pot First Nation located on Treaty 6 or Treaty 4 territory, sorry. She currently serves as the Director of Indigenous Clinical Trials Unit and the Indigenous Project Lead for the Accelerating Clinical Trials Consortium in the Faculty of Medicine and Dentistry at the University of Alberta. She also lectures in the Faculty of Education, where she has taught courses on Indigenous research methodologies and Indigenous Peoples education. Tabitha completed her PhD in Educational Policy Studies at the U of A in 2022 and brings extensive leadership experience across sectors, including education and public service. I consider Tabitha a friend and somebody who I've drawn a lot of inspiration from, and he's been really leading the way to allow, researchers and academics like myself to work in the space of medicine within the University of Alberta. With that being said, I'm going to hand it off to Tabitha.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Grant, and thank you for the invitation to be with you today. And my thanks also to WCHRI for extending the invite to be a part of this series. And thank you for, for saving me the slide around like introducing myself and all of that stuff. And the slide actually that I'm going to present instead is perfect. So I'm going to share my screen now, if that's all right. Grant had introduced me. I have taught courses in Indigenous research methodologies. All of my master's research and my PhD research follow the principles and the tenets of Indigenous research methodology. And so my knowledge of how to do this work safely and respectfully continues to grow. And I never really want to occupy the space where I say, I know all of the things, because I think it is sort of an evolving space and a growing space. We learn. And what I mean by that is when Dr. Wayne Clark approached me about supporting the Wapanakachos Indigenous Health Program in the faculty, he came forward with two scopes, and one of them was in regards to advancing clinical trial research with, for, and alongside Indigenous peoples. And I've done research typically or generally within the social sciences, never really within sort of the hard sciences. And despite not having a whole bunch of experience there, I thought, what an exciting sort of emerging field to start looking into. And that's sort of my entry into working in clinical trial research. And so since 2023, we've been working alongside First Nation, Métis, and Inuit partners in this area. And my understanding of ethical engagement with distinctions-based Indigenous peoples and communities in clinical research, typically within the hard sciences, has grown. And I'm happy to sort of share what I know now. Next slide, please. So a little bit of a roadmap of our time together. I'll spend a little bit of time self-locating before moving into sort of setting the context of my presentation for you today. We'll move into then exploring a little bit about the unethical foundations that I wouldn't say are the totality of the ethical principles of engagement that we see today, but have shaped sort of how we got here. Before moving into like how can we move forward together based on what I know and based on what your emerging understanding is as well. And then of course I'll leave you with a few key takeaways. I did add sort of one slide at the end this morning. I was thinking through just wanting to share a little bit more with participants today about my own experiences leading this work in a really sort of honest way. And I do that because I think it's important for both Indigenous and non-Indigenous researchers to understand the tension that we're experiencing and so that we're trying to navigate together. Not to leave it in your lap, but to help sort of build a shared understanding of some of the tensions that are inherently coming forward as we explore this new space. Next slide, please. Perfect. And the next one. Beautiful. All right. So again, thank you, Grant, for taking the time to share a little bit about my professional experience as well as my educational background. This is typically the slide where people would share like, oh, I have, all of these different letters at the end of my name and all of that. And I was thinking about this as I was getting ready and I was thinking about my late father, who always sort of helped me keep it simple. And he came to one of my talks early on when I first started working with the faculty back in 2014 and 15. And in his gentle way, pulled me aside and said, instead of sort of focusing on the things that you think people want to understand about you, what do you want people to know about you? And so he said, if you can describe yourself in 4 words, what would it be? And this hasn't changed very much over the years, but the 4 words that I came up with were reader, uh, reader, runner, writer, recovering overachiever. And I've stayed with that throughout since then, because I think it helps to me to keep grounded in the things that sort of bring me joy, but the things that have helped me understand my own sort of lived experience as an Indigenous person in what is now Canada. And the people that are on this slide are the people that I've been blessed to come to know and who have shaped who I am as a mother, as a friend, as a relative, as a colleague, but mostly just as who I am, as Nehio Esqueo, an Indigenous woman. So thank you. I'm really, really grateful to be here with you today. Next slide, please. All right, we're going to set the context a little bit. So bear with me. Sometimes my presentations are a bit of a journey. So I always like to sort of set the context to help us understand like the past before we can understand the present, before I can give you the tools to understand how to move forward in a good way. So I'm going to contextualize the current research landscape. Next slide, please. By articulating the present, by understanding the past. Next slide, please. Okay, so for those of you who are perhaps new to the research landscape or perhaps new to research with Indigenous peoples within academic settings or non-academic settings, um, maybe you're not familiar with the fact that it is a highly regulated environment in the current context. Right now, research with, for, and alongside Indigenous peoples is highly regulated by various things, like the Tri-Council Policy Statement, Chapter 9. There's also principles that are developed by the First Nations Governance Center called OCAP, or Ownership, Control, Access, and Possession of Research about First Nations people, as well as international instruments such as the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples that has specific clauses around ownership of knowledge and knowledge creation. Within the Canadian context, we also have what's called free, prior, and informed consent, which is typically assigned to sort of extractive sort of contract work around Indigenous lands. But the principle of free, prior, and informed consent is also something that guides our current research landscape. What's interesting and what I think have really grown to appreciate in my current role is the establishment of community-based and community-led research ethics boards. So typically, we tend to think only of institutional research ethics boards as being the sole determiner of what is ethically sound conduct within academic research. What's happened as a result, or what's happened over time, is that communities themselves have established their own research ethics boards that, if a non-Indigenous researcher or if an Indigenous researcher wants to do research with their community, they have to submit their proposal through that community REB before being granted permission to engage, to develop relationships, to even, yeah, speak with anybody about the research project in and of itself. One of a good example is through what's called First Nation Health and Social Science Social Secretariat of Manitoba, or FINISM. So they work alongside us in clinical research, and they have their own research ethics board. They have their own process, their own approval procedure. And I'll talk a little bit about that sort of at the tail end of the presentation, about how we're trying to use community research ethics boards to help sort of balance um, not only ownership, but respect for the rights of Indigenous peoples to be the determiner of what is safe, respectful research that meets their identified needs. And so there are also institutional research ethics boards, which I'm sure if you're within the academic setting, you understand sort of like the genesis of why they exist today. Um, and then on the other side, on the Indigenous side, we've started to fold in, and we start to see in research ethics applications or within research generally, an approach to research with and alongside Indigenous peoples that is principles based and that adheres to our natural laws. And so this is often seen in what we call the 4 Rs of research with Indigenous peoples, and I'll talk a little bit more about that as we move along. And then now, there are more sort of formal agreements, research agreements with communities that uphold our sacred teachings. So these are more than just sort of master agreements between, an institution and, an organization that is in receipt of funds or that is undertaking research. But these are research agreements that have specific stipulations around the protection of our natural laws and our sacred teachings. But if you're also maybe new to this landscape, perhaps you've experienced a little bit of that reluctance by Indigenous peoples to engage with non-Indigenous researchers. And sometimes that comes in the form of you're not hearing back from anybody, sort of this silence, not knowing like, why isn't anybody getting back to me? It's it is something that people come to me a lot with. Why am I not hearing back? How come the project has stalled? And it's often because of sort of the tensions that arise around sort of old practice and emerging practice coming together. And the need, I think, to build a shared understanding of how to move forward in a good way through a rights-based framework. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we move forward too. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is very high level. As we move forward into some of the examples of sort of extractive clinical trial research, this is a very high level of sort of how we got here. And so for generations, research really wasn't done with Indigenous peoples. It was done to us, it was done on us, but never with us, never alongside us, and never based on our identified needs. This was this arose out of this sort of ecosystem of Indigenous peoples were viewed merely as sort of passive subjects or objects of studies rather than partners. And the reason for this is um, principally because of the process of dehumanization that comes along with settler colonization. And so as a result, Indigenous peoples weren't viewed as co-constructors of research ideas, as partners in this space, but really as sort of passive subjects to be studied and looked at. And this has led obviously to harmful and extractive as well as exploitive research practices. And for the most part, non-Indigenous researchers were interested in studying what I consider to be sort of lagging indicators of the staggering disparities in health outcomes among Indigenous peoples, rather than focusing on, next slide, please, the social and structural drivers that underpin them. What do I mean by that? Well, I mean, we don't have uh, the depths of health disparities from nothing. They don't come from nothing. They come from all of the social and structural drivers that underpin it, such as state-sanctioned poverty, erosion of our ways of life, discriminatory funding regimes, as well as discriminatory policy, including the Indian Act, as well as the ongoing and lingering impacts of the Indian residential schools and forced displacement from our homes and our territories. Next slide, please. So in understanding that, it's important to then shift the gaze. And when we do that, um, along with that comes an understanding and a recognition of the need to move away from pathologizing Indigenous peoples as inherently unwell. And so sometimes people will talk about this, um, uh, and they'll say, we don't want to focus on deficit-based perspectives, right? So, 55% of First Nations men have, some form of diabetes, or, 45% of Inuit women, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So moving away from sort of that deficit-based, without understanding sort of the context, as well as the lived experiences of the peoples themselves. So moving away from pathologizing Indigenous peoples as, well, that's just sort of naturally, who they are, unwell. But really, when you think about it, strength-based resistors and defenders of to and against colonial oppression. And I sometimes write about this, and I step back from time to time and think about how I am, how my colleagues are, how my relatives are, the living embodiment of that resistance. We might carry with us the lingering impacts of settler colonization, but we are the living embodiment of resistance and the living embodiment of our desire to want to carry forward our ways of knowing and being. But in saying that, the impacts and the outcomes of colonization, they do show up in the statistics that we see, in health, in education, in social, and other social indicators as well. And I like to refer to them as sort of manufactured, not sort of, I do refer to them as manufactured outcomes as a result of settler colonization. And so when I say that, I don't say it to as sort of like shock doctrine or anything like that. I say it because of the experience that I bring with me as a result of working at the federal and provincial level, working with, for, and alongside other Indigenous peoples, understanding how sort of those structural and social drivers, um, the lack of our inability to address those structural drivers has manufactured what we see in both health, social, and other outcomes that we see today. And so when we understand it through that lens, research, and ethical research in particular, has to situate the problem at a different level. It has to situate it at the structural as opposed to the individual or the community level. And so when we do that, next slide, please. It means that we start to see and understand settler colonialism as a structure and not an event. Now, I don't know if this sits with people differently, but I learned about this not that long ago, and I've since sort of taught about it and used it as a tool in my own teaching and classroom environments. Because we tend to sort of focus on, let's go back to that slide where, no, don't go back, but let's just mentally go back to that slide that talked about the lagging indicators. So for the most part, a lot of our research focuses on the lagging indicators of those structural drivers. And those structural drivers are actually settler colonization acting as a structure as opposed to an event. What do I mean by that? Okay, well, so if we think about the residential school system as an example, and the TRC calls to action. So important to recognize that the work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission had to happen. It's important that it has happened. We're a decade away from the TRC calls to action having been released. This month, I think, is the 10-year anniversary of the calls to action in particular. And I think when I work alongside both Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples in these spaces, a lot of times we talk about reconciliation um, as being stalled. And there's a lot of frustration around by Indigenous peoples by the fact that so little movement has come forward. And or the fact that a lot of what's come forward, a lot of the acts of reconciliation have truly been nothing more than symbolic acts of reconciliation. What the TRC calls to action, what the final reports speak to, and what the late Justice Maurice Sinclair and what the Cindy Blackstock and the other commissioners are talking about and what they're referring to are redressing the legacies of colonization that show up within our structures. So what they're calling our attention to is the fact that, yes, residential schools and the lingering impacts of residential schools have to be attended to. We must atone for them. The reason why there are, the calls to action within those specific areas is because settler colonization affects those structures in particular. They're asking for substantive change within the structures, as opposed to simply honoring or attending to or atoning for residential schools. We tend to think about and are addressing things as an event, right? Like TRC, residential schools as an event. Residential schools is an event, but it speaks to, and what they're calling our attention to is settler colonization as a structural condition. And so when I teach about it, and what I'm hoping to share with everybody who's here with us today, is that our attention tends to be focused on really those attending to the event as opposed to the structure in and of itself. And so when we do that, we really only are sort of chasing the lagging indicator over and over and over again. And we never really get at the root of the problem, which is and continues to be the structural drivers, the state-sanctioned poverty, the dispossession of land, and so on and so on and so on. And so research problems have to then center on dismantling the structural conditions of oppression rather than fixing the problem, which up to this point, Indigenous peoples have been pathologized as the problem. There's all of this work around fixing the Indigenous person as the problem, as opposed to also understanding and fixing and addressing the system. Next slide, please. Okay. So, articulating the present, understand the past. We're going to move into unethical foundations of clinical research. So for those of you who maybe are unfamiliar with this, it might be a little bit difficult. So I'll just get you to move to the next slide, please. So this is just a content warning that the next slides, if you're not familiar with this content, might be a little disturbing for you if you are, or if you're an Indigenous person joining me today and you uh, are a survivor of any of these things. I hold space for you respectfully, and just want to honor if you're, need to step away, please do so. Next slide, please. Okay. So, one of the things that I'll share with you that sort of surprised me when it happened was, we have, as part of our work through the accelerating clinical trials, we have what's called our Grandmothers Council. So 5 grandmothers from across the country who so beautifully come together to help shape and guide our work in a good way through shared principles of ethical conduct, not only with each other, with us as researchers, but also to help guide and shape others who come forward to the Grandmothers Council. And so we view the grandmothers as sort of holding the greatest amount of authority over the work that we do. And so when I think about sort of like who is the most senior leader in all of those spaces, I think about the grandmothers. And so we set up, a meeting between the grandmothers and some other executive leaders to help sort of build a shared foundation. And, we explored the really dark history of clinical trial research. And what was sort of striking to me was that, a lot of this knowledge around unethical research on Indigenous peoples isn't common knowledge within the clinical science research space. And so I was sort of blown away by the fact that this is so this remains sort of hidden and out of view. And the intent is really to share with you, to raise gently to the surface the background and the context in which we carry forward this research. We have to carry it forward safely and respectfully, and that begins by some, truth telling about what has taken place. So some of that work or some of that past research has included vaccines and experiments. One of them was the BCG, or the tuberculosis vaccine experiment that took place between 1930 and 1950. It was done on Indigenous children with no informed consent, no parental consent, and some children were left as a control group while others were vaccinated against tuberculosis. It was conducted on Indigenous children who were in residential schools. And if you know anything about residential schools, they were deeply underfunded, highly overcrowded, poor nutrition. And so it's sort of, I mean, we could spend probably a whole hour talking about the ethical considerations, or the ethical, unethical considerations of this research, of doing research, TB research on children who were made prone, who were literally positioned to be in this space and then used as test subjects to test a vaccine. And then to not only that, but then to have a control group who was, sort of rendered even more vulnerable against TB. So these experiments took place between 1930 and 1950 in residential schools, and are now becoming more and more sort of common knowledge that this has taken place. Next slide, please. And if you're familiar with the Charles Council, which is here in Alberta, there were some additional vaccine experiments conducted on Indigenous patients without proper consent, where testing was testing and, I guess, preparations of the TB drug PAS, as well as thyroid stimulating hormones for hyperthyroidism in, quote, native races took place. So that's in the local context as well. Next slide, please. And then if you're familiar with Ian Mosby, he did some phenomenal research around the nutritional experiments conducted on Indian children in residential schools between 1940 and 1960. And so here Canadian researchers conducted nutrition experiments on Indigenous children, depriving them of essential nutrients to study the effects of malnutrition. And children were used as test subjects without their knowledge or consent. And schools were intentionally provided with inadequate or modified diets to observe the effects of vitamin and mineral deficiencies, while others were deprived of dental care to study the impacts of poor nutrition on oral health. Next slide, please. So the lasting legacy. One of the things that I love about Ian Mosby's work around the nutritional experiments, and the thing that sort of blew me away, because I read his work prior to developing some of the health curriculum for the Faculty of Medicine back in 2015. One of the things that blew me away about his research was that as a result of the intentional starvation and the nutritional experiments, what took place in residential schools on a massive scale was the literally changing the physiology of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit children. As a result, after they left, residential schools, left physiologically changed. And so for generations, what we now have are sort of the accumulated effects and impacts of that experiment, of that lasting state of deprivation. There are widespread metabolic changes as a result of starvation. Sort of, a body is more prone to fat and fat mass accumulation, which then leads to sort of increased risk for diabetes, which if you look at the research and I guess the health outcomes among Indigenous peoples and diabetes, we see the lasting impact. We see the generational impact of those nutritional experiments now. These also lend to increased, health risk. We now know that the direct impact of oral health on heart health. We know now if we thread the needle even further, starvation, oral health deprivation, and now increased and elevated risk of heart disease within a particular Indigenous population. It all sort of connects. There's this sort of large constellation of the lasting legacy of not only residential schools, but of widespread unethical research across this country. So there are ongoing intergenerational health impacts, as well as the ongoing and structural impacts of both food insecurity and structural deprivation as a result of chronic underfunding at every level. So that moves us into a space now of, well, what is the ethical legacy that we're left with? Next slide, please. The lasting ethical legacy means now that that informed consent is, I can't describe it. So I'm sort of overwhelmed by how important informed consent is. And it isn't simply about sort of walking into a community saying like, okay, we're going to do this research and I need your informed consent. It is so much more than that. It is about establishing that relationship from the very beginning, ensuring that Indigenous community partners understand the research, that they're co-designing the research, that the people that they're going to recruit to participate understand the research, are not only willing, but understand it at a deeper level. This isn't simply about sort of putting your initials on a piece of paper and walking away. Informed consent within the context and against the backdrop of that unethical and dark history carries so much more weight. We have a lasting ethical legacy to do informed consent different and in a better way. And there's this isn't my saying, and I've carried it forward. It comes from anti-oppressive and anti-racist praxis, and it's about nothing about us without us. There is no research that I support or engage with that hasn't gone through a rigorous process of answering that question. Nothing about us without us. No question, no research design is developed without us. No research question is developed without us. No research protocol is developed without us. It is all developed with us. And that helps to shape and inform consent I think, on a more principles basis as well. It now also means, importantly, that research is Indigenous-led, Indigenous designed, Indigenous-led, and Indigenous implemented. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that as well. Next slide, please. All right, so now we're talking about the present ecosystem, how we got here. Next slide, please. All right. If you read anything by Margaret Kovac, who's one of my academic heroes, she uses, she was the one to first sort of enter my mind around research as a dirty word, especially within the Indigenous context. So now that we've sort of walked through how we got here, it is unsurprising that research within Indigenous communities has become synonymous with mistrust, fear, and apprehension. Unsurprising. A lot of people don't have that sort of foregrounding to help sort of shape why, when they go to engage with the community, there's apprehension, there's no communication back and forth. It is because of the weight and the history of research and what that carries forward, the risks that brings into a community. Unethical sort of research, as well as clinical trials, medical experiments on Indigenous peoples, has fostered an ecosystem of harm where research really has only been understood as extractive and one-sided. It has lasting generational impacts with little benefit to the communities themselves. But over, I would say, the last 60 years, distinctions-based Indigenous peoples have moved into defining, defending, and asserting their rights within and across the research landscape in what is now Canada. And I'll show you a little bit more about what that means. Next slide, please. All right. So again, going all the way back to the very beginning where we talked about the present ecosystem around ethical research with, for, and by Indigenous peoples. This is guided by what is commonly known as the 4 R's of Indigenous research, which is really around sort of principled and principles foundations in Indigenous research. And these are respect, relevance, reciprocity, and responsibility. What does this mean? Well, respect means that research has to acknowledge Indigenous knowledge systems, our traditions, our governance, and our ways of knowing and being. And I would say that it's not simply about acknowledging. but it's about upholding and carrying forward our Indigenous knowledge systems, our traditions, our ways of governing, as well as our ways of knowing and being into the research proposal as well. It also means that research has to be relevant. It can't be a non-Indigenous researcher going, okay, so here's my dissertation. I want to study XYZ. I think, it would be great for me to, work with XYZ community and go out and say, I want to do this research with your community. It's my idea and I need it to get my PhD. It doesn't work like that anymore. Research has to be relevant. It has to be identified by the communities themselves as something that they would like to see addressed. That also means that I'm not saying like don't take your research idea out there. That could be something that the community is interested in understanding a little bit more. But it really, we're in a space now where Indigenous communities understand, know, and are able to articulate for themselves what research needs to be done, what research will uplift our aspirations for our future, rather than research that's driven solely by academic or institutional interests. That's really about, again, moving away from benefiting only one side versus sort of mutual benefit. And I would say perhaps benefit that leans more heavily towards Indigenous peoples and communities. There's also an element of reciprocity. And what does that mean? Well, it means creating mutually beneficial relationships where the research contributes to the well-being of the community. So, um, sometimes this is a little difficult for people to understand, um, non-Indigenous researchers to understand. And it's not I'm not saying that as a sort of a slight or as an insult, but reciprocity, it's more than sort of that economic benefit. Reciprocity is often rooted in relationship. And so um, reciprocal accountability within a research relationship carries forward with it relational obligations, where our research has to benefit and has to contribute to improving the well-being of the community in and of itself. That means the researcher is held accountable through relationship from beginning, middle, and end, and after the research. And I've got some phenomenal colleagues who have developed research relationships with Indigenous communities a decade ago, 15 years ago, to study a particular research topic, but they've carried forward that relationship, an ongoing relationship, um, out of reciprocity, out of reciprocal obligation, out of reciprocal accountability to maintaining a respectful relationship that moves beyond sort of that smash and grab. I'm going to take your knowledge, use it for what I need to, and leave the community behind. Reciprocity is about making sure that the benefit extends over a longer period of time. It's not just transactional. That leads into our responsibility as researchers to uphold ethical and moral obligations to Indigenous communities themselves, including maintaining accountability. What does that mean? What does that mean? It means that as the research moves forward, if there's research publications, communities are involved, they're aware, they consent, their data is used only for the purposes that it was collected for. And a good example of this is some research that was done in the United States. Some non-Indigenous researchers within a US university obtained consent to undertake some research. I think it included biomedical samples as well. The community gave permission to the researchers to use the biomedical samples for a particular study. Everything was fine. They had a research agreement, they had a master agreement, they moved forward together in partnership. And then what happened later is those same researchers used those biomedical samples, the data collected, for a different research project without consent, without informing the community. And so there was a long, of course, as you can imagine, a fairly protracted legal battle, not only to ensure that the biomedical samples were returned to the community, because there were specific protocols around burial, around rights of guess, community rights around passing and death. But also the researchers didn't have permission to hold on to the biomedical samples, but they did anyway. So there's an accountability as a result of some things that like that have taken place that continue to sort of shape our relationship, both non-Indigenous and Indigenous peoples within this space. So it's responsibility to do good, to do no more harm with the research and the research partnership as it moves forward. Next slide, please. All right, which leads us into the present context of a rights-based framework. So I'm so privileged to be able to work alongside my brilliant colleagues in Indigenous clinical trials. And what we know and what we are starting to see more and more is Indigenous peoples asserting themselves as rights holders. We're not merely consultative subjects. We have specific rights, not only constitutionally, but we have specific rights around how we do research. And so we are recognized as equal research rights holders as opposed to passive subjects. And so, like I shared before, we now have our own sort of specific approval bodies that permit or not research within our communities and that govern both research and researchers' responsibilities to carry the work forward in a good way. It also helps to specify the rights-based frameworks that I have encountered and that I am starting to sort of move forward in my own work in clinical trial research, pick up and identify what it means to respect and observe Indigenous peoples as rights holders in this space. It means that we respect our community-based protocols, which are distinct and unique. It means that we respect relationships with each other, and that we uphold our natural laws and our sacred teachings in the work that we move forward. It is principles-based, and it deepens our commitment to Indigenous peoples as sovereign and self-determining, not only over our own data, but over our outcomes, as well as what we share and how we share it and how we give our consent moving forward. And one of the things one of the books that I really love that has come across my path is by Robin Kimmerer called Braiding Sweetgrass. And there's one chapter, and I don't know why this one chapter has stayed with me as long as it has, but it's called The Honorable Harvest. Next slide, please. Which to me I've sort of pinned it in my brain as sort of four pillars of ethical research. And they are really to take only what you need. Don't be the first to take and don't be the last to take. So that really helps to guide and shift behavior. It is also about reciprocity, ensuring that we're giving back and that we hold our relationships constant and moving forward, that we are not only grateful, but that we show gratitude and that we uphold our responsibilities as researchers to do no more harm, and that we move away from this space of consumption, consuming Indigenous peoples and our experiences as knowledge to be harnessed, to advance an individual's, individual research aim. It really is about an ecosystem of doing better, of doing good, of working alongside, of taking a principled approach to research as opposed to an isolated, individualistic approach that centers only on the generation of one person's knowledge as opposed to a collective knowledge. Next slide, please. All right, now what? I realize we're running out of time, so I'll do my best. Moving forward in a good way. So next slide, please. Things to remember. As researchers, there will be caution. As you can imagine, like I've shared with you before, there is a past. There's a dark past that has yet to be atoned for, that has yet to be accounted for. So proceed with care, and rightfully so. It's important to prepare for developing lasting and deep relationships with the communities that you're wanting to do research with. There is no more smash and grab, take what you want, leave the rest. It is about everything, the whole research relationship. It is about start to finish and even after the fact. Be prepared to answer questions about yourself, about attending to that relational accountability. Who are you in relationship to the community? Who are you in relationship to the research? And who are you in relationship to Indigenous people's well-being overall, now and into the future? And be prepared to understand the difference between humility and humiliation. What do I mean by that? Well, um, it's humility as a researcher within an academic setting. It can be a hard thing to achieve. Oftentimes, I think within academia, we focus on, we focus so much on getting it right that we end up, I think, thinking that we need to humiliate ourselves as researchers, or that humiliation is part of being a researcher, being shamed or whatever. Humility within the context of Indigenous peoples research means that you come at this uh, from an open space, a space of openness to learn, to move slowly, to move carefully, to proceed with caution, to not move into that space thinking that you know all of the answers, but really to be open, to move into a space to be open to learning and to sharing. And so um, it can be a hard thing to balance. And I've moved through that space of oscillating between thinking that I need to um, uh, you know, be shamed by an institution for not knowing the answer, or versus really just holding humble space for myself as I learn and I grow. And so there's a bit of an inherent tension, I think, that some people sort of move through, and it's a necessary thing. I think that we need to hold constant as we move through Indigenous research moving forward. Next slide, please. So these are key takeaways for you. This is like your cheat sheet from today's session, but really wanted to focus. There are sort of three focus areas that I'm hoping to leave you with. The first is that settler colonization is a structure, not an event. The approach that comes from, or that is born from this, is that we need to take an informed, critical, and anti-colonial approach that focuses on the structural as opposed to the symbolic. So not looking at, trying to change the Indigenous individual, but trying to support the Indigenous individual through systemic interventions. The second is around ensuring the research meets the identified needs of and priorities of the community and not the researcher. This approach requires respect for timing and capacity and resources of the Indigenous community that you're working with. And the outcome of this is that it benefits the community and the people directly. So this is a substantive equality approach to research. The third focus is around addressing the root causes of historic and contemporary colonization. Now, I've talked about this in in another presentation around, sort of thinking about settler colonization as the big black bear in the back of the room. We all see it, we all know it's there. Uh, Nobody really wants to look the big black bear in the eye. And a lot of our work focuses on creating something that we can throw or toss in the corner to keep the black bear fed just long enough to keep us running a little bit faster, without sort of turning around and either looking the bear in the eye and killing the bear. And the bear is settler colonization. So when we stop sort of kicking things in the corner and start redressing the impacts of colonization as a structure and not an event, we honor and move forward a rights-based framework that uplifts and that does no more harm. And the outcomes of this obviously might be that Indigenous peoples, not the researcher, have outcomes that move the needle on those deeply inequitable outcomes that we bear witness to across all systems. So this is your cheat sheet. You can have that. And I'll move into the last slide. And I wanted to share one sort of final idea with everybody. And that idea, well, ideas are around sort of what I'm experiencing, or what we're starting to experience as distinctions-based Indigenous peoples in the clinical environment or clinical research environment. And this, I share this not to shame or to embarrass anybody, but really to talk about the tensions that are coming forward in the spaces that I occupy. Um, and so it might be important for folks who are doing clinical research to sort of think about these examples that I'll share with you as you move forward in your own way. So one of them is really around, um, gosh, this sort of really dogged pursuit of, mm, it's not, I don't, the dogged pursuit of upholding the 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 is it the supremacy? Yes, it's upholding the supremacy of Western science without balancing it with Indigenous ways of knowing and being. And so within clinical trial research, what I'm finding and what we're bearing witness to now is really like we design, develop clinical trial protocols alongside our Indigenous partners. Um, we put them forward. We try to balance Western science with Indigenous ways of knowing and being. And what we've sort of witnessed is the undertow of Western science. So no matter how far we advance Indigenous ways of knowing within this Western science framework, and as much space that is said to be claimed to make space for Indigenous peoples here, the undertow of Western science for us to adhere to those tenets of reliability, of, of randomization, the undertow is so strong that our research has sometimes shape-shifted. We've lost sort of focus of our ability to um, hold that balance between Western Indigenous ways of knowing and being. And so there's such a strong focus um, on those two pieces, which I get, and I completely understand it. They are the cornerstones of clinical trial research. We're not asking for those to be completely abandoned. But what we're asking for is a little bit of space, I think, for the recognition that, randomization, especially within the context of communities that have been deprived for centuries, we can't deploy an intervention and only give resources to one group and deprive another. There are ethical considerations around the randomization component of that in order to achieve that reliability that is the cornerstone of clinical trial research. We can't achieve that without attending to colonialism as a structure, not an event. That conversation is starting to emerge, that we can't seem to reconcile it right now, but we're moving forward into a space of saying like, I can't ethically, I mean, maybe ethically on paper, randomization makes sense for a non-Indigenous population, but for an Inuit population, for example, randomization into a group that receives food versus a group that doesn't receive food within the context of settler colonization that has led to the depths of food insecurity to the state that it is now. Ethically, it regenerates and reinvigorates mistrust of clinical trial research in Canada. So we're starting to sort of move into those spaces. And so I offer that up for the clinical researchers that are in these spaces as just like one example that we're running up against, and invite the conversation around like, how do we carve out a more shared, a more balanced approach to clinical research moving forward? And that's it. Thank you very much.
Wow. Thank you, Tabitha. Definitely no huge surprises on my end, but I've been doing this work for quite a long time, and I just sat here kind of nodding my head, just thinking about how important it is to really make sure that people within all the different spaces of health, whether it's clinical trials or biomedical and everything else that WCHRI actually works in the space of, needs to hear this information and to really sit with it for a bit too. So again, I want to thank you for gifting your knowledge to all of us today. I really hope that everybody had something to take away. I know we're a little bit over time, but I do want to give some space for at least one or maybe two questions before we move on. So if you want to either raise your hand or maybe put a question into the chat for Tibitha, then we can see what else do we have on our minds today.
I'm sort of driven to distraction. They're doing construction around here. I can't.
Same here, actually, of construction right on, right, and we live in the same spot now. Uh,
Golly.
okay, any questions?
Jeffrey! Aw,
So
my friends.
I have one question.
Yeah.
So, as somebody who works in this space as well, one thing I find is it's often policies and institutional requirements and all these different things that make relational accountability, that make all the things that you're asking for very challenging.
Mhm.
So my question to you is, if you were to give one piece of advice, maybe let's say to the group here, and we all work in our different spaces to try and challenge these institutional things, what would that be and what would that look like?
Yeah. Well, that a great question, and thank you for that. Um, so I think one of the examples, and I don't know if we have talked about this, Grant, but one of the things that we're doing um, is around. So right now, anyway, there's a movement to have a single REB across Canada. Of course, as you can imagine, that sort of flies in the face of sort of our work that is distinctions based. It's individual. It recognizes it's impossible, I think, to have a single REB. But all of that being said, at the same time, we're calling in the need to perhaps uh, flip the model on its back. So instead of a single REB being the sort of the issuing authority that grants that permission to proceed, instead what we're doing is we're saying, actually, the researcher should go to the Indigenous community that they want to do research with, have developed that relationship, have co-designed the protocol, and have sought and received approval from that nation level REB before even submitting it to the national REB, before submitting it to an institutional REB for approval. That kind of relational accountability, the one that says, I recognize and I see the ecosystem of harm. I see how your rights as Indigenous peoples have been upended as a result of all of these institutions that don't recognize you. It says instead, we actually recognize you first. We recognize your voice and your rights first before we recognize anybody else's. That kind of relational accountability, I think it invites Indigenous partners in. It scares non-Indigenous peoples because I think we've become really accustomed to only recognizing one sort of single authority. But at the same time, I'm finding that there are a lot of partners who are willing to take on that really difficult conversation. So yeah, hopefully that answers your question.
Nope, that's great. Thank you. So I know we're over time now, so I want to thank you again, Tabitha, for everything today. I want to thank everybody
Yeah.
sharing space today. Uh,
Thanks,
and
everybody. And I see my pals from the clinical trials office. I give a big shout out. They helped me learn along the way. So thanks, everybody. Thank you, Grant. And I'm so grateful for you in this space. So thank you.
thank you as well. Take care. Take care,
All right.
everybody.
Bye.